September 1944. A blood-soaked bridgehead on the Moselle River. Smoke rises from 3 destroyed German tanks, their blackened metal still sizzling in the mud. Exhausted American infantrymen sit slumped against sandbags, their faces covered in soot and dried sweat. They just survived 3 brutal enemy counterattacks. Every single one of their commissioned officers is dead or severely wounded. A tough, battle-hardened sergeant stands among them, holding the defensive line together with sheer willpower. He just saved his company from total destruction. But miles away, in a clean, quiet office, a staff officer looks at a piece of paper and decides this sergeant is not qualified to lead. He denies the man his earned promotion because he lacks a college degree. General George S. Patton is about to find out, and he will deliver a harsh, unforgettable lesson on what makes a true leader. This is the story of what happened when General Patton defied high command to promote a meritorious non-commissioned officer who saved his unit at the Moselle River. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. First Sergeant Mike Kowalski was 32 years old. He came from the coal mines of Scranton, Pennsylvania, serving with Company B of the 318th Infantry Regiment, 80th Infantry Division. Before the war, he spent his youth dropping into dark, narrow shafts to harvest anthracite coal, earning pennies to keep his family fed after his father died in a cave-in. He only had a 5th grade education because the mines took him early, but he understood terrain, pressure, and survival better than any man with a university degree. He had already survived the hedgerows of Normandy, carrying the scars of mortar shrapnel in his right thigh and the memory of dozens of friends buried in shallow French graves. He did not seek glory or polished brass buttons, but he knew the men left under his care needed a leader they could trust to keep them alive. The brutal crossing of the Moselle River had stripped his unit of its officer corps, leaving him to hold the line with nothing but raw grit and 30 surviving riflemen. Colonel Richard Sterling was 45 years old, serving as a senior personnel officer at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London. He grew up in an affluent neighborhood in Boston, Massachusetts, and entered the military through a prestigious peacetime commissioning program before the war began. His uniform was perfectly tailored, his trousers held a sharp crease, and his leather boots shone like glass under the electric office lights. He viewed the United States Army not just as a fighting force, but as an institution of refined social status where gentlemen commanded and laborers obeyed. He firmly believed that an uneducated minor lacked the proper social pedigree to wear the bars of a company commander. To him, regulations were sacred, and allowing a man without a college degree into the officer corps threatened to degrade the prestige of the entire military establishment. By September 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had turned into a desperate, grinding race against time and logistics. After breaking out from the Normandy beachheads during the summer, American forces sprinted across France, pushing the German army back toward its own borders. But the rapid movement had strained the Allied supply lines to the absolute breaking point. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and individual combat units were forced to fight with dwindling resources. The German army, despite its massive losses, was consolidating its defenses behind major geographic barriers, turning every river crossing into a lethal bottleneck. The Moselle River became one of these critical barriers, a deep waterway flanked by high bluffs where the defenders dug in with artillery and heavy armor to halt the American push into the Saar region. In this environment of high-stakes combat, standard administrative procedures often collapsed under the weight of tactical necessity. Division commanders frequently made rapid decisions in the field, relying on the immediate instincts of their non-commissioned officers to prevent total disaster. Yet, back in the rear echelons and administrative headquarters, a parallel war of paperwork and bureaucratic stubbornness persisted. Staff officers who had never heard the whistle of an incoming mortar shell insisted on maintaining rigid adherence to peacetime protocols, even when those protocols cost lives. Other senior commanders often let these bureaucratic denials slide, unwilling to fight the administrative machinery of higher headquarters while trying to manage a massive logistical crisis. The front lines were bleeding, but the personnel offices remained cold and uncompromising, focused entirely on forms and requirements rather than the desperate reality of the men holding the muddy riverbanks. That systemic rigidity was about to collide directly with the smoking reality of the Moselle bridgehead, Captain Arthur Vance, a 31-year-old battalion staff officer from Richmond, Virginia, walked into the makeshift headquarters tent holding a folder of combat reports. He approached the pristine field desk where Colonel Sterling sat reviewing administrative logs. Captain Vance cleared his throat and stood at attention. "Colonel, I have the formal recommendation for First Sergeant Kowalski's battlefield commission right here." He took the company over under direct enemy fire, stabilized a collapsing line, and successfully beat back 3 separate armored counterattacks. General Patton has already reviewed the tactical report and wants this approved immediately, so the men have an official commander on the riverbank. Colonel Sterling did not look up from his ledger. He adjusted his fountain pen and turned a page. "The recommendation is denied, Captain." Captain Vance lowered his hands, holding the folder tightly. "Sir, with all due respect, B Company has no officers left alive. Kowalski is currently holding the entire bridgehead with 30 exhausted men. They trust him implicitly. He earned those bars on that riverbank today." Colonel Sterling closed his ledger with a deliberate click. "The regulations are entirely clear on this matter. Vance, a combat commission, requires proper educational credentials. Sergeant Kowalski possesses a 5th-grade education. He is a laborer from the coal fields. He lacks the refined background, the university degree, and the gentlemanly officer training required to hold a commission in the United States Army." Captain Vance stepped closer to the desk, his voice strained. "He doesn't need to recite literature to fire an M1 Garand, Colonel. He just stopped 3 German tank assaults with an understrength infantry company. The men are dying out there while we debate his schooling." Colonel Sterling leaned back in his chair, crossing his polished boots. "An army is built on discipline, structure, and tradition, Captain. If we begin handing out captain's bars to every uneducated enlistee who shows a bit of physical courage, we degrade the prestige and authority of the entire officer corps. The social hierarchy exists for a reason. Men of his class are suited to follow orders, not to formulate them at a command level. The paperwork stays denied." Captain Vance stared at the colonel for a long moment, realizing the rigidity of the rear echelon could not be moved by arguments of blood and mud. "I understand your position, Colonel, but this directive comes with the personal interest of the field army commander." Colonel Sterling picked up his clipboard and stood up. "I am well aware of General Patton's theatrical tendencies. That is exactly why Shachef keeps personnel officers in the field to enforce the regulations. I will fly down to that bridgehead myself to deliver this final denial and ensure the proper chain of command is maintained without administrative contamination." Captain Vance saluted stiffly, turned on his heel, and walked out of the tent to notify the high command. The formal report of the administrative denial reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The engine cut out, leaving only the sound of distant artillery and the crackle of burning rubber from a nearby wreck. The general stepped out onto the blood-soaked soil of the bridgehead, his eyes scanning the exhausted infantrymen of B Company before locking on to the pristine uniform of Colonel Sterling. Every man on the riverbank went rigid. The air grew completely still. Patton walked straight into the center of the perimeter, his boots kicking aside a spent shell casing. He looked at the bodies being lined up near the water, then turned to the staff officer who held a clean clipboard in his manicured hand. Patton's voice was quiet, but it carried across the entire muddy bank. "Colonel, what is your business at this river crossing?" Colonel Sterling stood at attention, clearing his throat to regain his composure. "General, I am here to personally deliver the formal denial of the battlefield commission for Sergeant Kowalski and ensure military regulations are maintained. Did this man fail to hold the bridgehead?" "No, sir, he held it. But he lacks the necessary college degree required for an officer rank. Did the German tanks ask for his credentials before he blew them to pieces?" "Of course not, General. But HF policy states that promoting uneducated enlisted men degrades the prestige of the officer corps. Patton studied him. He looked at the polished leather of Sterling's boots, then down at the mangled corpses of the American soldiers who had died carrying out Kowalski's orders. He looked at the black smoke rising from the shattered hulls of the enemy armor that still threatened the crossing. You stand here on a field of dead men and talk to me about college degrees, Colonel. You sit in a warm office in London with a fountain pen, while this sergeant holds the gates of hell with 30 riflemen. You tell me about social hierarchies and gentlemanly training, while the river behind you runs red with blood of miners and laborers who gave everything they had to buy us this ground. Kowalski didn't need a university education to cross this river. He didn't need a diploma to organize a defense against a division of panzers. He just needed guts. The United States Army is not a country club for elite Bostonians to showcase their family crests while working-class boys die in the mud to save their titles. It is a fighting machine, and the only pedigree that matters on this battlefield is courage under fire. You have a choice. You can step aside and watch me run this army the way it was meant to be run, or you can face the consequences of obstructing an operational command during active combat. Decide now. Colonel Sterling swallowed hard, his face turning pale as he looked into the cold eyes of the army commander. He remained completely silent, unable to find a single regulation to shield himself from the general's fury. Patton unpinned the 2 silver general stars from his own collar. He stepped forward through the thick mud, reached out, and firmly pinned the bright stars onto the torn, wet shirt of First Sergeant Kowalski. The resting infantrymen gasped, their eyes widening as they watched the army commander transfer his own rank to a low-born miner right there in the dirt. Patton looked at the astonished soldier and declared him a captain by his own unchallengeable authority on the field. He then turned his gaze back to Colonel Sterling, who stood frozen in absolute horror at the open violation of Army protocol. Patton did not offer a salute or a word of parting comfort to the bureaucrat. Instead, the general reached into the back of his command jeep, pulled out a heavy metal trench shovel, and shoved it hard into the colonel's clean hands. He ordered the immaculate staff officer to remain at the smoky riverbank to help Kowalski's men dig trenches and bury the dead. You can leave when you figure out what makes a real officer, Patton said. The surviving rifleman watched silently as the proud colonel, his uniform already ruined by the falling soot, slowly pushed the metal blade into the heavy, blood-soaked earth. Captain Mike Kowalski went back to Pennsylvania after the war ended, returning to the coal fields of Scranton in late 1945. He never went back into the mines, instead using his military experience to work as a safety inspector for the regional railway system. He lived a quiet, unassuming life in a small brick house with his wife and 3 children, rarely speaking to his neighbors about his time in Europe or the silver stars pinned to his collar. He kept those original general stars in a velvet-lined cigar box inside his dresser drawer for the rest of his days, passing them down to his oldest son before he died in 1978. Colonel Richard Sterling remained at the rear echelon for the rest of the European campaign, his record permanently tarnished by the formal reprimand Patton placed in his file for obstructing tactical operations. He returned to Boston in 1946, leaving the military to pursue a career in corporate consulting, where his focus on rigid organizational structures was highly valued. He never forgot the cold weight of the trench shovel or the smell of the burning German armor at the riverbank, carrying a deep bitterness toward Patton's methods until his death in 1969. General Patton kept the original operational log of the Moselle crossing in his personal desk drawer until his fatal automobile accident in December 1945. In a private letter to his Imhoff, written just 3 days after the promotion, he noted that the true strength of the American Army came from the soil, not the schoolhouse. I would rather have a company led by a man with mud on his boots and ice in his veins than 100 gentlemen with degrees and no stomach for the fight, he wrote. Some historians have argued that Patton's battlefield promotion of an uneducated sergeant was a reckless violation of the established military hierarchy that undermined the standard administrative authority of higher headquarters. They contend that rigid regulations exist to maintain uniform standards across a vast global army, and that bypassing those rules creates chaotic precedents during theater-wide operations. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that the ultimate purpose of any military structure is to win battles and save lives, meaning that tactical competence must always supersede administrative background. They maintain that true meritocracy on the battlefield requires recognizing leadership where it is proven. What is certain is that the bridgehead on the Moselle River remained secure. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have followed the official Army rules and waited for a formal review? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.